Hello everyone, this is Cobain the Christian. Today we're going to be continuing my series of interviews with my brother on the journey which ultimately led him from agnosticism back through theism and to Christianity. Before we get into today's interview, I want to say that if you are in a financially good spot and enjoy these videos, please do consider making a monthly contribution to my Patreon. $10 and up will guarantee you access to all content, and the final part or parts of this interview dealing with the questions and answers will be premium content. If you are not able to give $10, you might consider giving 99 cents per month via Anchor, which I will link below. And remember, now I am running a podcast at the same time as YouTube, so if you would prefer to listen rather than use YouTube to watch these videos, and there's no PowerPoint in this one, so it fits more naturally in podcast format. If you would rather listen, the podcast form of the videos will be up within about 12 hours of the actual video upload. So welcome back, Jake. It is good to have you.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
Yeah, a lot of people asked if you looked as similar to me as you sounded, and that is apparently the general consensus. So I've always had a profound admiration for myself, so it's good to have that admiration for my brother as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so last time we ended in, I think, 2015. It had been about 2.5 years since your deconversion, where you became an agnostic, and it took you about 2.5 years to get back to theism. What I wanted to start off asking you is, why do you think it took so much longer to come back to Christianity than it did just to come back to theism?
That's a good question. I don't know if I can give if I fully know the reason why. I think maybe one reason why is it seems that the conversion to theism was a sort of, you could say, almost sort of a paradigm shift, and kind of what I was working through over the next several years was more of a it was almost kind of working out the details of what I believed. So maybe in that sense it just took longer to kind of work through the particulars.
Yeah, so you see kind of Christianity unfolding out of the basic reality of a personal God understood in the classical sense.
Yeah.
So tell us what your state of mind is at this point in time. You've come back to theism. Is there any kind of day that you remember realizing, I believe in God? You remember a moment where it kind of hits you that you think that this is true?
Yeah. Well, I think the argument that I discussed last time that I had for idealism really just convinced me that materialism is wrong, right? So I don't quite remember if I came to believe in God then, but it certainly seemed that God was very probable. I think I can't say there's a particular day, but I just kind of found myself believing that there's a God.
And were you surprised at all? Because I know when my doubts about Christianity were resolved, even though I'd never left Christianity, and even though I'd been kind of an active Christian for several years, when I finally kind of resolved my doubts to my satisfaction, it was almost surprising to find that after all of this, Christianity turned out to be true, that I wasn't just fooling myself. Were you surprised when you were reflecting upon your journey? Did you reflect upon your journey?
Was I surprised about believing in God?
About coming back to believe in God. Did it ever strike you, well, this is kind of weird that God turns out to have existed after all?
Yeah, I can't say I was like shocked, right?
Mm-hmm.
About believing in God. I mean, I think because there was never a time where I would have identified as like an atheist, right?
Right.
So
let me just ask you: Were you at any point ever kind of remotely attracted to the new atheism?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, there were times when I found where I thought, well, maybe atheism is true, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe that is the kind of materialism is the truth, and religion is essentially, like a fairy tale or something like that.
Right.
It's hard to assess. Before I'd come back to theism, I had been, or had my, I guess, kind of an official comeback to theism. I had been, getting more and more interested, you could say, in just religion in general, and then also in things like Neoplatonism and Platonism. So it almost felt like this was, this is just kind of where my interests were heading, and it just all kind of fell together, or all kind of came together.
So the theism is kind of part of a larger shift in your interpretation of the world.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's the thing is that I started to realize that there were more nuanced ways to interpret the world than what I had been given. So I guess in a way, before I became an agnostic, right, before that time, there was a sense in which how to interpret the world and what the world was made up of was fairly, how to put this, I guess fairly binary, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it was kind of, okay, well, maybe just the material world exists, or maybe there are some sort of supernatural entities, and consciousness or the mind exists.
In addition to the material world.
In addition, right?
Yeah.
But I think with idealism and even studying, philosophies like Neoplatonism, there was a sense in which, well, maybe there are different ways to interpret the world.
Yeah. Are there any authors that you remember as being particularly influential here?
About converting, or?
Well, just in kind of your journey into theism in the kind of Platonic context.
I can't say at this point. I mean, it wasn't something I had looked at very deeply yet.
Right.
So, I mean, I had mentioned that I had gotten into Carl Jung, and I mentioned I, got into kind of Joseph Campbell and Mircea Eliade, I think is how you say his name. I mentioned I read like The Experience of God by David Bentley Hart, and I thought that was, I thought some of the arguments kind of felt like it confirmed what I was thinking, and kind of really said what I was kind of feeling about religion and about God at the time.
Yeah. So, let me ask, I don't remember if we talked about this last time. Had you read, or were you reading any kind of atheist literature, atheist books?
I mean, I had read some atheists before. I'd read a few books. I mean, some of them weren't...
Give a couple examples.
Okay, I remember there was... but this was... well before my conversion to theism.
Right.
There was one, Why I Became an Atheist by John W. Loftus.
Yeah.
And at the time when I read it, I found it quite convincing. I found the arguments to be... Or I found it to be quite a strong kind of counter-apologetic. Right?
Yeah, because this is kind of a cumulative case. It kind of attacks Christianity from all directions.
It's a cumulative case, and I feel like it, if you have a fairly superficial understanding of some of these issues, it can be quite compelling.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of overwhelming. I know that in my own journey, I'm very thankful to divine providence that I was permitted to encounter a lot of these arguments one at a time, so that I didn't have to deal with Israelite religion descends from polytheistic origins. At the same time, I'm dealing with the scientific critique of theism and stuff like that. And I think for all of his flaws, Loftus in that book does rhetorically choose a good strategy, which is kind of attacking Christianity from all directions at once, not just the resurrection, but also the Old Testament, also philosophically, so that even if you're not persuaded by one of his arguments, it just seems the overall picture of the world that he's constructing is a naturalistic one.
There was another book I read, The Case Against Atheism.
The Case Against Atheism?
No, sorry, The Case Against God, I think is what it was called.
Okay, is that Michael Martin?
I forget who it was written by. I think that was what the book was called, but it was in some ways I think it was like it's definitely one of the most interesting critiques of you could say of theism, because the arguments felt very original. It was definitely very different than a lot of kind of atheist rhetoric.
Like what kind of arguments?
It's been years since I've read it, but in general it tried to attack essentially it attacked God as kind of an incoherent concept. So it tried to show it was logically incoherent.
Yeah, yeah.
So I read that. I don't feel like I read like a lot of like explicitly atheist literature, but I felt like I read books by atheists.
Okay, yeah.
Like books with that worldview.
And to what degree were you involved either as a participant on forums or watching videos? To what degree were you cognizant of this debate playing out on the internet, if at all?
I mean, I watched some content. You know, I can't remember like the specific channels, but I was certainly aware of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I didn't find I don't think I found the rhetoric to be very compelling on either side.
Right.
Probably,
Yeah.
is what I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
Okay. So you're a theist now. It's 2015. You've come to believe in God. You kind of see it within this larger philosophical paradigm. Where do things move from here, or is there kind of like a period where you're at kind of intellectual rest? What's the next step in your just journey?
Yeah.
What are you looking at next? What are you interested in?
Well, I had mentioned already. I had begun to gain an interest in kind of studying religion more seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to think. So I mentioned Mircea Eliade, and I remember reading quite a bit of his work. So just kind of, I think I read his 3-part volume on the history of religion.
Three volumes.
3 volumes. Yeah. Or I read, read several of his books. I think he had one on shamanism. I read. There was a book. I think his most famous book is The Sacred and the Profane, which certainly really made sense of religion as a phenomenon. You hear a lot of people talk about what religion is, and it gets reduced to religion's just a belief in the afterlife.
Yeah,
right. Well, I think the book Sacred and the Profane really gets down to the core of what religion is composed of.
Yeah.
There were, what did I read? I remember, and again, kind of a controversial author again. I mean, not just within the religious community, but very controversial today. I got into Julius Evola a little bit.
Yeah.
And then...
Where did you learn about these books?
I think I just saw some guy quote from Julius Evola, and I looked him up, and I looked. He seemed kind of different. Like I'd never.
Yeah.
So, I began to read some of his stuff. I read, really through Julius Evola, I got into René Guin a bit, and then another guy I got into with. He's a perennialist. Fritjof Schuon, so that was kind of I started to get kind of into the school of, you could say, of traditionalism or perennialist philosophy, and I think one of the things that attracted me to them was the fact that they're very good at breaking down symbolism, right. So really explaining religious symbolism.
Yeah. And it's interesting that it's happening to you at this point, because I think, as you know, from 2014 to 2015, my own kind of way of looking at the world is undergoing this seismic shift through reading authors like James Jordan and Peter Lightheart, through coming to affirm, to my own great surprise, the historicity of those early chapters of Genesis, which kind of resituated the world on a much firmer Christian foundation. Through rejecting kind of evolution, which had been an important part of my worldview for a long time. And so symbolism was also becoming very important for me at this point, though through a very different route. I don't remember how much we were talking a bit about this stuff. To what degree did what was going on in my life have any influence in your journey at this point, if at all?
Yeah, I don't remember talking too much about it. I mean, I think we had conversations here and there about stuff, but I don't really remember ever conversing much about symbolism. I mean, I was
Right.
I was kind of, somewhat aware of what you were into at the time.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I mean, remember one of those things which really fascinated me, and I was just thinking about this today, was the discovery that monotheism is demonstrably the earliest religion of mankind, and that the one God who created all things and who gives us a way of righteous living, that concept is ubiquitous, relatively speaking, around the world. And I found that very exciting because it was, it moved Christianity from being an ideology to, this is actually the concrete real story of the world. Were you, to what degree did the notion of, history of religion shape your view of theism and God's potential interest in mankind?
Yeah. Well, I guess just kind of going off what you said about how this idea that that monotheism was perhaps the kind of the primordial religion, or I think as I studied kind of religion through these authors, there was a sense in which how religion is presented today, or how is it kind of the models that religious scholars kind of work under today are wrong or too simplistic.
Yeah.
So so typically, like if you were to listen to a mainstream scholar on the history of religion, he would say first people were animists,
right?
Then they were polytheists, and then the end point was monotheism. Right.
Yeah.
That seemed to me to be too simplistic.
Yeah.
Right? Too simplistic. I even the terms, I would say monotheism, pantheism, polytheism are too simple.
Right. Yeah.
The reality is typically more complex.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And if my listeners aren't familiar with this, or if you've just taken it for granted, there's a great deal of evidence for this paradigm. Anthropologists today do not really take this model seriously. It was popular in the early 20th century in the history of religion school, but today the origin of religion, as far as I know, is regarded as more of an unanswerable question, because the answers that's actually found in the evidence is profoundly uncomfortable. And the only place in which scholars seriously think that polytheism evolved into monotheism is in Old Testament studies, because they never got the memo that nobody buys this anymore. So if you want to more on that, look at my video on did biblical monotheism develop.
And I would say that many cultures may have a belief in several gods, right, or several sort of heavenly beings, but many cultures also tend to understand that there's a supreme deity who has, you could say, the qualities of the traditional kind of monotheism.
Species unique.
Yeah.
In the words of Michael Heiser. I mean, this is kind of, it's an interesting point, because one of the questions posed to Christians is, well, you disbelieve in all these other deities, we just believe in one less God. And it's not actually the case, because not only do we not necessarily disbelieve that there's supernatural activity undergirding these pagan cults, not only do we believe in a vast commonwealth of heavenly beings, but cultures around the world seem to have an understanding of the God of heaven, the supreme God who created all things and who's distinct from everything else, in addition to those gods whom they worshipped on a more intimate level. So it's a category error.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I guess getting back to my, what kind of studying these authors, or what studying the history of religion did for me, is I think it gave me a framework of, a symbolic framework to kind of interpret the world.
Yeah.
And I feel like at that point, symbolism was something new for me, and once I started to grasp that, it seemed that a lot of things started to just kind of make sense.
Could you give what do you mean by symbolism? It's a complex concept, but in case people are wondering, what exactly does this mean for you in this context?
Yeah, it's difficult to articulate, right? Because I think a symbol has been kind of reduced to a metaphor, right? Yeah. But it seems that if we take the cross, for example, right? It's like, it's not, the symbol of the cross is not just something that Jesus died on, right? It is that, but it's a lot more.
Yeah.
You could say it encapsulates and kind of sums up a lot of parts of reality, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It links heaven and earth, and then it links, the earth within itself. It's both horizontal and vertical.
It's, if you could say, well, in some sense, all motion is made up of the horizontal and vertical kind of motion, right? So
all things are being gathered together at this point.
So, I mean, I think that's kind of the best articulation of symbolism I can give, is that it's something that almost kind of sums up a lot of aspects of reality, right?
It's the meaning which undergirds the stuff of the world. Yeah. And I think you'd say that the symbol, kind of the symbolic worldview in this context, and there are many symbolic worldviews, but in this context it means that meaning is intrinsic to stuff. Right, not just that the world as a whole has a meaning, not just life has meaning, but specific things in the world have specific meanings, which are in principle intelligible.
And the world's inherently symbolic, right?
Yeah.
That's
what makes it what it is.
Yeah.
So, which authors are particularly influential in shaping this for you?
I mean, I think Evola was like an influence. I mean, I can't say that like necessarily like in alignment with him on politics, but I think in terms, I always found what was most interesting about him was his ability to kind of expound the traditional conception of the world.
And for those who are not familiar, could you just give a summary of what Evolos Program is? And of course, it should go without saying, this is not a statement of agreement with everything in his program, but what is his program?
I mean, Evola was a radical traditionalist, right? So he essentially objected to, you could say, the modern world, right?
Revolt against the modern world.
Yeah, I think that was the first book I read. And he kind of had, I don't, it's been a while since I've read him, but there was essential.
And when is this published?
When did he publish it? This must have been in the
early 20th century, I think.
Yeah, it might have been in the 40s he published it.
Okay, yeah.
But he wanted a sort of a kind of a radical kind of return to tradition.
And what is tradition for him?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Is it Christianity?
No, it's certainly not. I mean, he saw Christianity as actually the downfall of tradition. Right. So he would have said that the Roman Empire fell because they stopped sacrificing to these pagan deities.
Does he think that the pagan deities are real beings who?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, right? I don't think he would say that there are these kind of anthropomorphic kind of beings that exist out there. I forget exactly what he says, but it is this idea is that within every culture there is a sort of a preservation, you could say, at the primordial tradition.
Yeah.
But that his idea was to kind of reinstitute this primordial tradition,
including animal sacrifice.
I think so. I mean, another thing too was he was very big into the caste system, right? So that it was very important for people to be in their proper caste, and it was actually, I mean, it was good for the person. He would have argued that, right? It was beneficial for their soul. I can't. It's very hard to sum up his ideas, and again, I don't think I found his politics the most interesting as much as he was able to kind of expound on symbolism and things of that nature.
Is there anything in particular that he said that kind of had an effect on you in convincing you that this was actually real, that this is not just intellectual masturbation, but that the symbolic interpretation of the world is the legitimate, true interpretation of the world?
I don't know if there's anything he said in particular. It was more just getting a sense of a new way of looking at the world.
Yeah, that this option is out there.
That perhaps the world of scientific materialism is not the primary way to look at the world.
Yeah. So while this is going on, is there still any sense in which you are engaged within the atheist-theist debate, as a listener? Or have you kind of moved on to different questions?
It's interesting. At this time, I think I feel like the atheist-theist debate really was kind of coming to an end on the internet. And maybe I just wasn't listening but it seemed like the real debates going on the internet were political. And
this is 2015, folks, so
yeah.
I mean,
so actually I think in 2014 is that within the atheist community is you started to see a split, right? You saw these kind of radical progressives,
atheism plus,
yeah. And these radical progressives, and then you saw a number of people within the atheist community who were troubled by this, troubled by this kind of nonsense.
Now, Go Green 18, you familiar with Go Green 18?
Yeah.
Didn't she start dating this is just a total tangent, but didn't she start dating some traditional conservative or whatever?
I don't know. I
heard that had happened.
I mean, I know she's come out and admit that that she doesn't stand by that all that she held before.
Oh, really?
I think she. Well, I don't.
She's an ex-Mormon, by the way, guys.
She. It seemed to me that, I mean, I haven't followed her closely, but I remember her. She was in dialogue with a lot of people she disagreed with. And in friendly dialogue. And she was attempting to really make an effort to kind of understand those who she disagreed with.
Religiously?
Yeah.
Okay,
so, I mean, I think, there was, I think I saw, when the last video I watched by her or whatever, it seemed to me that she had come to an understanding that perhaps her worldview wasn't adequate, or perhaps, wasn't...
Needed to open her mind a little bit.
Needed to open her mind, yeah.
So, what relationship did your reading of the traditionalists have with your own thought about the political world at that point, if any? Were you thinking about the political sphere? And
no,
okay.
Not really. I can't. It wasn't the primary thing on my mind.
Right.
Yeah.
And by politics, I don't mean necessarily the election. I mean just the broader structure of our monarchy versus democracy.
Yeah.
Those larger order questions. Were you thinking about those?
I mean, I had thoughts about it, but I think I was probably at the time more in alignment with, you could say, liberalism, kind of broadly speaking.
Okay, you were consciously.
Yeah.
Classical liberalism.
Yeah, essentially.
Okay, right. So another question I wanted to ask is, after you've become a theist, was there ever a point where you doubted theism, or you thought, well, maybe I made a mistake, maybe I should have, maybe materialism is...
There were points, but never very serious.
Yeah. So once you make the transition, it's hard to go back.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're reading the traditionalists, you're a theist, you're kind of taken by the symbolic approach to the world, and you're kind of encountering a broader range of views and options about seeing the world. Tell me where you're going from there. Tell me what's on your mind, and what do you think about Christianity at this point?
Yeah.
Are you agnostic towards Christianity, or would you still say I disbelieve in Christianity? What's going on in your mind about Jesus?
I think I think through the study of symbolism, I kind of came to understand Christianity in a new light, right? That the doctrines of Christianity weren't just these kind of weird, incoherent, babble or whatever, but that they had some sort of symbolic meaning to them.
Yeah.
So I would have said I was an agnostic to Christianity, I think, ultimately. It seemed to me at the time...
You thought it had a real chance of being true?
I mean, it's hard to say exactly what I thought at that point, but I don't think I would have discounted it. I think at the time what it seemed to me was that there was a lot of agreement between various world religions in a certain way. That they did seem to be... there was something kind of fundamental that they shared,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I feel like I was attracted to a sort of perennialist kind of conception of the world.
Yeah.
But even that was kind of vaguely defined.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, I also wanted to ask, and this kind of pertains to the period since your deconversion in general. To what degree were you ever attracted to social progressivism? Not radically, but even same-sex marriage.
I think I never felt like I entertained the ideas of social progressivism,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, but I don't think I ever fully committed to the idea of social progressivism.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think it was just kind of checking various ideas to see if maybe, they were correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you've consistently been the most apolitical member of the family.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're kind of agnostic towards Christianity. When do you start going to St. John's, by the way?
That was 2017.
2017.
Okay,
so
wait. Yeah.
do you want to pause?
No. Sorry. Pause, actually.
So where do you go intellectually from here? What's the next step? What are you interested in? How does that shape the overall journey?
Yeah. So I guess maybe we can. It's always hard to kind of trace out the exact kind of line, but I do remember in 2016 is when Jordan Peterson started to come on the scene.
Yeah.
And I think that was kind of a very interesting thing to watch.
Yeah.
Because he was speaking to a lot of the kind of the political issues that were happening at the time, but he was also saying more, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like he was the first person on the scene to really actually to not just talk about the kind of just politics, but have something more behind.
Yeah.
Discovering him was interesting because he was interested in a lot of the same authors I had been interested in. So I remember he was, I think on his reading list he has two of the most prominent authors. It's Carl Jung and Mircea Eliade.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that was just very, very interesting to see, in the culture.
Mm-hmm. And
it seemed like that this was something big because it was the reemergence of really a sort of a religious worldview, right? That he was someone who was very, he was a role model for a lot of people, but he was bringing in these kind of, you could say, kind of religious symbols into.
Yeah, and there's a very practical, very concrete dimension to what he says, but it's got a lot of depth to it. There's an underlying, and by the way, folks, this doesn't mean one endorses everything that he says, but I think it's hard to dispute that there's a lot of people who've been introduced to some very important questions and have had their lives changed for the better by this stuff. But go on.
Yeah, I think philosophically, I think with some of his ideas, I find some of his ideas philosophically problematic.
Yeah.
But I think people who dismiss Jordan Peterson, I feel sometimes, I just feel like that is, just given how much young men in particular, have responded to him. Yeah. It doesn't seem that you can just dismiss it as just silliness,
right,
or some guy speaking nonsense.
Yeah. So what kind of effect does that have on you?
Yeah, I think, again, it's hard to narrow down one effect, but I think one thing it does is it gives a new framework to understand religion in a way, to where it's not simply about certain beliefs you have about where you go after you die,
right?
But it's about a way of being in the world.
Yeah.
Right? That you could say myth or religious symbols actually have some pertinence to one's life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I am interested, did you have any beliefs about the afterlife? Did you think, was it something you thought about?
Yeah, no, it's something I thought about. I can't say I would have ever committed to one idea.
But what was on your
I
mind?
mean, I thought maybe reincarnation was possible or something like that.
How come?
How come?
Yeah.
I think the idea was somewhat appealing at the time.
Yeah.
Some of the evidence I found to be compelling.
Yeah, children with memories of...
Yeah.
For those who aren't familiar, I would say, and I think Jake doesn't believe in reincarnation, but what I would say is that there are instances where two separate children have the same memory of someone who's recently deceased, which indicates that there is something real going on, but it doesn't seem to be that the soul has left one person and become incarnated in a new child. It seems rather that there's some means by which the memory of someone recently deceased can become attached and present to the conscious mind of a person in the early stages of their kind of mental development. And I think there's also some evidence for genealogically transmitted memories. I remember reading one account which was interesting of someone who just kept having these vivid dreams of like a watchmaking shop, and it turned out like several generations back his great-great-grandfather had been a very well-known watchmaker in the area. So these are real phenomena, but there are several different explanations for it, and reincarnation I don't think is the best one. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. So anyway, go on with where you are in the bigger picture.
So I think with Jordan Peterson, it wasn't so much that I felt introduced to something new, but it was almost, I was introduced to almost someone who was saying kind of things I had been kind of feeling things, where he was presenting religion not just as a set of creedal, like what set of doctrines, but as kind of the story we all occupy. That narrative is something fundamental to humans, and religion is fundamentally the narrative that we live in. So
it's always it's a powerful experience when you're kind of in the midst of adopting a paradigm and you find that where you thought you might have been idiosyncratic, someone else who clearly has a head on their shoulders gives a very articulate presentation of those same kind of things which are in your mind, and having someone else articulate kind of these intuitive senses in a much more precise way, I think is a powerful way by which you can sharpen up on a particular kind of newly adopted plank of your view of the world. So anything else going on significant at this point in time?
I'm trying to think. It's always hard to kind of recover.
It doesn't have to be strictly chronological. Is there just anything from this whole period you talked about that you think should be noted in any particular books which stuck out in your mind? Any particular intellectual questions that aren't necessarily directly related to this? What was catching your fancy? What's going on in your head at this point in time?
I mean, I can't really say. Like, I don't feel like there was a lot of. I don't feel like my viewpoint changed a lot in this period of time. I mean, I think it was just the kind of there was, I would say I was continuing to kind of question the paradigm, let's say, I received.
And you were a reader of Rupert Sheldrake as well, weren't you?
I read some of his stuff.
So for those who don't know, Rupert Sheldrake is a biologist. I mean, he's not a Christian in the orthodox sense of the word. I would say he's probably a liberal Christian, but he's a strong critic of materialism, and he questions a lot of the received wisdom about for example, the brain. He questions, is memory really stored in the brain? Well, there's no evidence that memory is stored in the brain. He looks at things like parapsychology, quote unquote, because things like feeling when someone is staring at you, that's not parapsychology, it's normal, everyone experiences it. And he looks at the data and makes a very compelling empirical argument against materialism. And let me just say that I've run these tests myself, and you can run them online, but I've run them like over 2,000 times, and with a 99 percentage probability against chance in terms of like picking the card that the computer is about to select. So the rate at which I select the correct card is far above, given the number of instances in which I've taken the test, far above what you would expect given naturalism. So what would you say interested you about Rupert Sheldrake?
Well, I think his ideas seemed interesting and quite out there.
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously he was. I think I read his book on morphic resonance, and I mean he's a fairly good scientist, I think.
Yeah.
So I think he's asking, or he's at least kind of asking the right questions.
Yeah.
I guess I would say maybe in general during this time, and again, this is not exactly in chronological order. There was kind of I was kind of coming to understand the cosmos in a more enchanted way.
Yeah.
So I read several authors during this period. I don't remember everyone I read. I mean, I even read some people from the New Age movement. Yeah. But I think they seem to be offering kind of a sort of enchanted vision of the cosmos.
More intellectual, serious New Age guys?
Yeah, yeah. There was one guy who I read named Gary Lockman.
Okay, yeah.
Who he writes a lot of books just on either figures or like he has one book on Carl Jung. He just writes a lot on essentially a lot of figure, like kind of you could say kind of occult figures in the 20th century. Yeah. There was a book I read. He wrote a book on Hermes, like he wrote a book called Caretakers of the Cosmos, which was an interesting.
And what was that book about?
That idea was essentially in some ways it's not. It articulates a vision not that dissimilar from Christianity, right? That essentially mankind is supposed to take care of the cosmos and almost complete it in a way. Yeah. Right. And so he was writing that kind of in response to, you could say, what is it? These people who talk about, well, humans are just a blight, are a cancer on the earth. Yeah. Right. So it was almost in response to that. And, it seemed to be articulating a fairly, a vision of the cosmos I found quite appealing. That humans had a fundamental and important role to play in existence. Yeah.
What was your general pattern of thinking at this point about man and man's role in the cosmos? Now that you brought that up.
Well, who was it? I remember there I think there's a story in like the hermetic corpus or whatever, where I think Hermes or whatever receives a revelation from Nous, right? So from Nous, which is the Greek word for mind, which is essentially similar to the Logos, right? And I think even some of them called the Nous the Son of God, right? So.
And when is this like written down? This is an ancient document.
Yeah, I mean, during the time, I mean, I think a lot of people, like for a while before the Renaissance or no, before the Enlightenment, a lot of people believe this to have gone back like several thousand years, like he received this revelation near the dawn of man or something.
That's a common theme within this kind of tradition is, for you have the idea of like a secret tradition that goes back to Solomon's temple about the architecture of the universe. Or even in like Kabbalah, you have the idea that the Zohar goes back to the 1st century and then it's kind of published in the 11th century. And by the way, I'm not totally opposed to that necessarily, but it's just interesting to see that theme. But
I mean, I think some people would have, I know during the Renaissance period, there was some people would have tried to identify this figure of Hermes with, I think some people identified it with Moses, some people identified it with Enoch, some people identified it with Joseph, but yeah. So, but there's a story in I think it's in the Hermetic corpus about Hermes receives this revelation from Nous, where he says that man is of two natures, right? On the one hand, he has this animal nature, but on the other hand, he has this almost this kind of semi-divine nature. This this kind of spark of the divine, right? And as I was studying religion, that seemed to me to be correct, right? That on the one hand, man is an animal, but on the other hand, man is something more than an animal. That man, you could say, reaches beyond. And I remember, I don't think I read this anywhere, but I had the insight that it seemed significant that man was the only animal that stood upright, right?
Yeah, I was just about to mention that. Yeah.
So it was, and I guess I saw, you could say, the products of culture, right, as coming from that, you could say, that spark of the divine. Or
that man exercises a creative role with respect to the world and takes the raw material of the world and shapes and transforms it into something more glorious. In biblical terms, man is the generations of the heavens and the earth, as Genesis 2 says. And as elsewhere in Genesis, it always refers to offspring, the generations of Adam, the generations of Isaac. Man is the son of the heavens, the spirit of God, and the earth, the dust of the ground, because man draws the dust of the ground, the whole material creation, into the presence of God. So it's an echo of a biblical theme, I think.
Yeah. Well, I guess in a way, you could see through that I was kind of coming to more of a Christian kind of conception of the universe. And I think what bothered me about a tradition like Hinduism is that man doesn't really seem to be going anywhere.
Yeah.
Right? That it just seems that you have these 4 ages and it's just a decline.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then the cycle begins again.
Yeah.
Right? Where I found the idea that, well, perhaps the world's getting better slowly, but man is being improved to be a much more appealing idea than this idea, well, it's just one decline and then...
Yeah, I mean, this is marginally related, but this is one of my big problems with the culture of kind of pop young earth creationism, which is there's this obsession with, there's the fall and, entropy, it has the significance as, everything is decaying, whereas, Christianity, but I mean, as a matter of kind of reading of Genesis, I believe in its historicity. I mean, I believe in a recent creation, but the thrust of Christianity is that man is God's instrument in bringing the world from glory to glory, and the incarnation brings the world into the presence of God, and the resurrection makes it such that the world is not a fallen world, full stop, but it's also a fallen, redeemed, glorified world. So I agree with you. I think that's something which is just kind of innately beautiful and compelling. So you're kind of approaching a more Christian anthropology, you'd say. Yeah.
I mean, I would even say that, I would have, I don't know if I would have made a commitment, but I would have thought of something, or would have kind of posited something very similar to the Logos or whatever, right? Something like a Nous or so
as a philosophical
idea that made sense. Yeah.
And what was your relationship with any of the Bible? Had you done any serious reading of the Bible? I mean, or even semi-serious reading of the Bible? Had you read through the Gospels, or do you have any interest in asking, the historical questions about the Gospels, just as, at least in an academic sense?
Yeah, no, I did. I mean, I thought about it, and I actually read a little bit about it.
You did?
Yeah, not tons, but I think the question of the historical Jesus was an interest to me. Yeah.
And what was your takeaway?
I mean, I guess I was suspicious of this idea of whether he claimed to be God.
Okay, yeah.
That was, I guess, I didn't necessarily get that impression when I read the Gospels.
Or at least the first 3.
Yeah, the first 3, right? Yeah. I would have admitted, like, in John's Gospel, it's very, very clear.
Yeah.
So, but I don't think I would have came down on, like, a definite position, right?
On whether he claimed to be divine.
Yeah, divine.
Right.
Yeah. So
what do you remember any of the authors you'd read on the historical Jesus at this point?
think I remember one. I read part of his. I forget. It was some German scholar. I think kind of a liberal, or he was a theologian, but a liberal kind
John
of.
Robinson, not John.
No. I can't remember his name, but he was a liberal kind of Christian theologian.
What strikes me about Jesus and his divinity across all four Gospels, I do think you can find these kind of explicit claims to divinity when framed in the right sense in the Synoptic. But what strikes me is the relationship that he presumes himself to have with those to whom he's speaking. I mean, saying things like, if you don't love me more than you, so much that you hate father and mother in comparison, then you can't be my disciple. I mean, something like that. He has this kind of relationship to demand absolute loyalty in and of himself. I find that almost to be a more compelling case from the whole canon for his divine consciousness, because it's a relationship that you imagine a prophet saying, you have to love me so much that you hate father and mother in comparison. It's a bizarre way of speaking. He almost seems to assume himself to have divine authority in that kind of way. Though I also think you have those explicit claims to divinity in all four Gospels. But was it just kind of an incidental look at this material?
Yeah, it wasn't like a super serious look, right?
Mm-hmm. Did you have any impression on the historicity of the New Testament, the authorship of the four Gospels? Did any of those questions interest you?
A little bit. I mean, I can't say that the issue of authorship ever interested me like a huge deal. I mean, in some ways I don't necessarily think it's the most pressing matter in some sense.
Well, I mean, in relation to the question of historicity.
Yeah, that's true. But
how about the Old Testament?
Had
you read any?
I might have.
But it wasn't a big like part of your.
I mean, there was some interest in it, right? I mean, I came up against Kabbalistic ideas, and in some sense, I think, and I was interested too in the history of religion in general. So I was interested in like the developments in Judaism, and kind of mystical elements in both kind of Christianity and Judaism.
Did you read any of the traditional Christian spiritual authors?
I don't know if this counts as traditional, but I actually read some Meister Eckhart.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Vladimir Lawski, if you're not familiar, did his dissertation on Eckhart. He's a very interesting theologian.
Yeah.
And some of his theology was condemned by the papacy at that point in time, though he himself was not personally condemned. But I think he has some interesting kind of past between East and West there.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. What led you to look at Eckhart?
Well, actually, I think Evola did.
Okay.
I read somewhere that actually Eckhart was an influence on him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How about any other religions? Islam, Mormonism. Did you have any? Can you remember looking at any of these? Did you develop a passing interest in, the history of any of these traditions?
Yeah. I mean, I studied. I'm studying the history of Buddhism a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Hinduism and some of the stuff from China. Taoism and Confucianism seem to be very interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with? I just saw the author of the book was reviewing Wynne Corduroy's book on original monotheism. You ever seen this book, True Son of Heaven?
No.
It's by a guy who, he seemed pretty. I didn't take a look, so don't take what I say as gospel. But he seemed pretty professional, and he described writing a dissertation on Chinese religion and ancient Chinese theism, and he talked about kind of Confucius and Lao Tzu being a theist in the traditional sense.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that in Taoism and Confucianism, there are a lot of ideas that are very compatible with Christianity, right? This whole, I think in Confucianism, you have this whole idea of ritual being important because it's the joining of heaven and earth.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
And I mean, even in the Tao Te Ching, I feel a lot of the you could say what's the right word? a lot of the passages there also express ideals very similar to kind of Christian morality.
Yeah. And of course, this is before the coming of Christ, so it's during the so-called Axial Age. So Israel has come back from its exile, and there is, at the moment of their return from exile, this development all over the world of philosophical systems, and there's a renaissance of thought in apparently disconnected ways. It's an interesting period of history.
I think too, it's interesting to note, I think Heraclitus doesn't write that long or after. I don't know exactly.
Heraclitus?
The philosopher who talked about the logos.
Okay, yeah. I know what you're talking about, yeah.
About the logos being kind of you could say that thing which unites all things.
Yeah.
But I think he's writing roughly at a similar time as Lao Tzu.
Yeah. Right? Well, it's Daniel describes, in the context of describing the four beasts, which are the four great empires which will guard and protect Israel until the coming of Christ. And I don't think they're villainous beasts, that's why he said they're guard and protect, but it describes the winds of God blowing over the Gentile sea and calling these beasts up out of the sea. And this is a reference to Genesis 1. Daniel 7 is a creation week pattern, but I think you do kind of see this idea of the wind of the Spirit blowing across the whole world at this point in history, creating a kind of creative burst of intellectual activity, which shaped the inner identities of these civilizations in many ways down to the present day. Mm-hmm. So this is we're in 2016.
Yeah, 2016. Some of the stuff is out of order, but it's around kind of some of the stuff I've been describing, I think happened around maybe late 2015, 2016, 2017.
Okay, and you go to college in 2017.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's probably a good place for us to break off. But before we do, I just want to, what would you say? Do you have any, putting you on the spot here, what would you say to the person who is doubting Christianity for the first time? Would you have any kind of, what do you say to them? What do you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know exactly what to say. I mean, certain people might respond differently to different types of arguments.
Yeah.
But I guess I would say, before I look at certain particular issues like the historicity of the Gospels or arguments for the existence of God, I would look at how does Christianity hold together as a framework, meaning what is at the center or what is at the core of Christianity, and try and see if it's a kind of a coherent vision of the world.
Well, great. So we will see you, I think, in a couple days. We'll have the third part. And by the way, if you have any questions for Jake, you can put them in the comments, and during the Q&A session, I will ask those. So the final part, a couple parts of this video, the Q&A, will be premium content, though perhaps eventually I'll make it public. So if whether or not you are a patron, you can ask those questions, and I will ask Jake. So thank you so much for listening, and I will see you tomorrow.